I want to take this slowly, not to explain anything, not to convince anyone, just to speak honestly. For a long time, I believed that staying busy meant I was moving forward. I didn't question that belief because it felt practical. If my days were full and my mind was occupied, I assumed progress was happening somewhere beneath the surface. I was always working on something, adjusting something, preparing for what came next. I told myself that clarity would arrive later, once I had done enough, or learned enough, or improved enough. I treated uncertainty as something temporary, something effort would eventually erase. From the outside, it looked like discipline. It looked like responsibility. But internally, there was a quiet tension I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like failure. It felt like restlessness without a clear reason. I ignored it. Ignoring it was easier than slowing down. Slowing down felt risky. It felt like losing momentum. And losing momentum felt like falling behind an invisible line I couldn't see but believed was there. So I stayed busy even when the direction wasn't clear. Especially when it wasn't clear. I convinced myself that confusion was part of growth. That pressure meant progress. That constant effort was proof I was doing something right. I didn't notice how rarely I stopped to ask whether the direction itself made sense. Movement became the goal. Over time, that habit stopped being intentional and became automatic. Whenever uncertainty appeared, I responded with action. Any action. Action felt safer than waiting. Waiting felt like doing nothing. And doing nothing felt like failure. I filled my time with effort. I filled my mind with information. I filled the silence with plans and ideas. Silence made me uncomfortable. It felt unproductive, almost wasteful. Whenever things slowed down, I sped them back up without thinking. I began consuming more ideas than I could apply, more perspectives than I could properly evaluate. Everything sounded convincing. Everything sounded urgent. Everything demanded attention. I didn't realize how much that constant input was weakening my ability to think clearly. When everything feels important, nothing feels grounded. I didn't notice how reactive my thinking had become. I was responding instead of choosing, adjusting instead of deciding, staying busy but never fully settled. I told myself this was ambition, but it felt more like restlessness. There wasn't a moment where everything fell apart. Nothing broke. That surprised me. I expected change to come from impact or failure. Instead, it came from a quiet awareness that something wasn't aligned. I felt like I was moving efficiently in a direction I hadn't fully chosen. That realization didn't arrive loudly. It arrived slowly, almost gently. It stayed with me longer than I expected. I didn't rush to fix it. I didn't try to explain it away. I just noticed it. And that was new for me. Noticing it changed the way I paid attention to my days. I began to see patterns I hadn't seen before, patterns that had been there for a long time. I noticed how quickly I tried to solve discomfort instead of understanding it. Whenever something felt unclear, my instinct was to add more effort, more structure, more pressure. I believed that if I could just tighten things enough, clarity would appear. But clarity never arrived that way. Instead, the more I forced movement, the more scattered my thinking became. I was busy, but not settled. Active, but not intentional. I realized I was using activity to avoid something I didn't want to face: stillness. Stillness felt unfamiliar to me. It felt exposed. When I slowed down, questions surfaced that I had learned to outrun. Questions about why I was doing certain things. Questions about whether the effort I was giving matched what actually mattered to me. Those questions didn't demand answers right away. That was the unsettling part. They just stayed there waiting. And for once, I didn't immediately push them away. I began to understand how often I rushed decisions simply to escape uncertainty. Uncertainty felt uncomfortable, so I treated action as relief. Even if the action didn't lead anywhere meaningful, it gave me the feeling of control. But control is not the same as clarity. As I allowed more space, I noticed how many of my goals were inherited rather than chosen. They came from comparison, from expectations, from ideas I absorbed without questioning. I had accepted them because they were common, not because they were aligned. That realization wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost disappointing. I had spent years chasing things I never fully examined. I also noticed how much information I was consuming without reflection. Advice stacked on top of advice. Perspectives layered over perspectives. Everything sounded reasonable, but nothing felt anchored. When everything sounds convincing, discernment weakens. I realized that constant input had trained me to react instead of think, to respond instead of choose, to move instead of understand. I had mistaken urgency for importance and speed for confidence. Confidence, I began to see, doesn't rush. It waits. It allows questions to exist without immediately filling the silence with answers. As I spent more time sitting with uncertainty, my thinking slowed. Not in a dull way, but in a deliberate one. I began to hear my own reasoning again, my own values, my own limits. Limits I had been ignoring. I had treated limits as obstacles instead of signals. Something to overcome rather than something to understand. But limits carry information. They reveal where effort no longer serves growth. That shift in perspective changed how I viewed pressure. Pressure had always felt like proof of commitment, but I began to see how constant pressure blurs judgment. It narrows focus. It makes everything feel urgent, even when it isn't. I started paying attention to the difference between pressure and direction. Pressure pushed me forward without asking questions. Direction invited me to pause and consider where I was going. I noticed how rarely I had chosen direction consciously. Most of the time, I was simply responding to momentum, letting speed decide for me. That awareness stayed with me. It didn't demand action. It didn't insist on change. It simply remained present, quietly reshaping how I looked at effort, ambition, and progress. And with that awareness, something inside me began to loosen. That loosening didn't feel like relief at first. It felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. I had spent so long measuring myself by output that moving more slowly felt like doing less. I wondered whether I was losing drive or discipline. But as time passed, I realized something important. What I was losing wasn't direction. It was noise. Without constant pressure, my thinking became steadier. I wasn't constantly correcting myself anymore. I wasn't chasing reassurance. Decisions didn't feel dramatic. They felt considered. I began to notice how often I had been trying to prove something, not to others necessarily, but to an idea of who I thought I should be. That effort had shaped my pace more than I realized. When I stopped proving, space opened, and in that space, priorities clarified, not loudly, quietly. I didn't suddenly know all the answers, but I stopped rushing to fill every gap. I allowed uncertainty to exist without immediately turning it into action. That patience changed how I moved through my days. I trusted fewer impulses, but I trusted my judgment more. I started evaluating progress differently. Instead of asking how much I accomplished, I asked how aligned my decisions felt afterward, whether they created clarity or tension, whether they added stability or scattered my attention. Some paths began to fall away on their own. Not because I rejected them forcefully, but because they no longer made sense. Letting them go didn't feel like failure. It felt like honesty. I also noticed how often rest had been framed as something earned rather than something necessary. I had treated stillness as a reward instead of a requirement. But stillness wasn't taking anything away from me. It was giving me perspective. Perspective softened my thinking. It allowed nuance. It reduced the need for constant certainty. I realized how often certainty had been a substitute for understanding. Understanding takes time, and time can't be rushed without distortion. As I adjusted to this quieter pace, I felt more grounded, not excited, not driven by urgency, grounded. That groundedness made my effort more intentional. I chose fewer things, but I chose them with care. I stopped confusing endurance with wisdom. Endurance has value, but wisdom knows when to change course, when to pause, when to admit that effort is no longer aligned with direction. That distinction changed how I viewed growth. Growth wasn't about constant expansion. It was about coherence, about bringing effort, values, and direction into agreement. I noticed that clarity didn't demand attention. It didn't compete with noise. It waited patiently until I was willing to listen. If you are listening to this and something feels familiar, I want to speak gently. You don't need to rush your understanding. You don't need to force certainty. You don't need to pressure yourself into clarity. Sometimes the most important shift isn't doing more. It's noticing more, noticing patterns, noticing tension, noticing what no longer fits. That kind of noticing isn't passive. It's attentive, and attention changes things quietly over time. If this reached you during a season where things feel busy but unsettled, know this: you are not behind. You are not failing. You are becoming aware. And awareness isn't the end of progress. It's where meaningful progress begins.